Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Farid Rahmanovich, and as always, I'm joined by Brother Kareem.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
In this series, we're doing a chapter-by-chapter exploration of Sayyid Hussein Nasr's book, A Young Muslim's Guide to the West. We'll be focusing on one portion of a chapter in these sessions and delving more deeply into ideas within the passage, like what implications you can draw, conclusions you can come to, and showing you how to read these kinds of complex texts more closely. Now, in today's session, we're actually starting part 2 of the book called The Nature of the Modern World, and we are looking at chapter 8, Religion in the Modern West. So, what caught your eye?
Alright, let's take a look at page 148. Nasr's conclusion at the end of the chapter. He starts the paragraph by saying, "It is the Islamic community in the West that should in fact bear the primary responsibility for providing an understanding of religion in the West for Muslims, studying it in depth and making the result of this knowledge known to the rest of the Islamic world, where the contact with the West has bewildered many Muslims, not only the young but also the old, and where the understanding of the role and meaning of religion in the experience of Western man remains usually shallow." That by itself is a pretty dense sentence, so let's stop there and let's take a look just at that. We can come back to the rest of the paragraph later. So we start with the idea that it is the Islamic communities, specifically in the West's, responsibility for providing an understanding of religion in the West for Muslims. The first thing that implies is it is not the responsibility of someone else. Alright, who would that someone else be? Well, presumably, Muslims not in the West. So, if you want to understand what religion, in this chapter specifically, if you want to understand what religion is like in the West, and what issues they run into, we really need to be the ones doing that. You should not be going to some sheikh who lives on the other side of the world and who has never been here and has probably only read about it or heard about it from other people, and expecting him to diagnose for you the ills of the Muslim or of the modern world, specifically in our context, America. It would be equivalent to you getting a diagnosis by a doctor who has never actually met you, right? Imagine if you go online and you just kind of list out your symptoms, and some doctor's like, well, based off of what you have said to me, and I have not actually seen you, but just what you said to me, this is what is wrong with you. Well, there is a website called WebMD.
I was about to say.
People go there, and apparently everyone has cancer.
Yeah, everything is cancer, yeah. Yeah, because no matter what the symptoms are, they are also cancer symptoms. Oh.
Right, so I mean, I guess that can put into perspective exactly what the issue is here.
Yes. Yes, and unfortunately, not only do you have the bad diagnosis, imagine going to WebMD and finding out that you quote have cancer, and then having to figure out how to treat yourself on the basis of that diagnosis, because that's ultimately what it is, right? Like, you call up some random person in China and you're like, I have cancer, and they're like, have you tried chemotherapy? And then you go home and you got to figure out how to do that. It's not particularly
right, and then
useful.
You go through chemo and you discover you just had the flu.
Yes.
Right,
or better yet, you have to figure out chemo on your own. Yeah, it's the ability to diagnose a problem requires us to meaningfully look at what it is that we're doing and where we are and how that's working and not working, and what it means to be where we are, and what that place looks like, and not even what it looked like 30 years ago. You have to look at it right now in order to be able to project where are you headed, so that you can make some sort of a meaningful diagnosis and therefore attempt a solution.
Mm-hmm. But in the case of an entire society or an aspect of a society like religion or its history, I think you really do need to go back at least somewhat, right? You need to understand the history in order to understand how we got to this point.
Oh yes, yes, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to imply that the history of the place where you're at doesn't matter, but that you can't figure out what problems you're facing and how to fix them if all you know is history from 50 years ago.
Sure.
You need that history from 50 years ago in order to see the trajectory and like how you got to where you are. But if all you have is that without any knowledge of where you currently are, then, problem. And that's why somebody who studied the West 30, 40 years ago, or somebody who was here like half a generation ago, but then spent the rest of their life living in Malaysia or something, can't adequately sort of contribute to the conversation because they're missing the now part.
Sure.
Right? They're great for the history part if that's what they studied, but they're not great for this is what's happening at the moment and how to deal with that portion.
And what compounds that problem is that things are changing so quickly.
Oh yes.
Here in the West, right? As we were discussing earlier, just even the concept that gay marriage would be acceptable, as an example. I mean, 30 years ago would have been virtually unthinkable.
It was unthinkable about 22 years ago, because I think Don't Ask, Don't Tell got passed in 98, something like that. That was considered like super cutting edge of gay rights. And I mean, but by today's standards, like that would get you shot by the left.
In 2008, which is only 12 years ago right now, both Democratic candidates who were trying to get the nomination for the presidency, which is Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, came right out and said that they believed that marriage is between one man and one woman. Okay. And fast forward not even 12 years, fast forward just 8 years ahead to about 2016, and that's become a bigoted position among a large portion of our country's population.
So the rate of change is accelerating, and so yeah, if you're not in the thick of it, you can't really understand what's going on. That's sort of like an armchair general kind of approach, and I think a big part of the problem is that you are necessarily both missing the context and anything like a really functional meaning of what's going on. And so with a very inadequately compressed picture, you can't meaningfully contribute. So that's part one. The Muslims here are responsible. The other part might be that it's the Muslims who are responsible. You can't say like, no, the society needs to tell us. Like, no, they don't. You need to figure out where you are.
Right. I mean, who are you even going to go to in our current society to tell you what's really going on? Our society has become so polarized. It's practically bifurcated. Right? The idea that we have, one group of people who have almost like their own set of truths, and then a separate group of people in this country who have a completely separate set of truths, to the point where they can look at the exact same event and reach opposite conclusions, because it's almost like they're seeing opposite things. And so, like, who do you go to? Do you go to, some, liberal scholar? Do you go to some conservative scholar? What the middle doesn't really seem to exist anymore, and even that implies that the middle is somehow good, or is somehow right.
Yeah.
Right. Which is itself, has a lot of problems with that idea too. As we pointed out just a few minutes ago, right, the middle is moving, right? If the country as a whole is moving, then where the middle is moving too. So, yeah, I mean, even that doesn't really work. So who are you going to go to? We can't, necessarily trust any particular outside source. There's another problem we have as well in our current society, which is there's this increased reliance on one person. I'll just call it guruism right now. The idea that there is someone who you can go to who can give you truths on everything. Right? And some of them may be very intelligent people who are very good about one or two things, and that's great to go to them for information about those one or two things. But why are you looking to them for everything? The new atheists have a big problem with that, right? You've got these figures like Dawkins who are specialists in one thing, right, like biology, and now all of a sudden they feel like they can talk about everything.
Yeah.
Neil deGrasse Tyson got absolutely dragged online when he tried to interject with some of his opinions on Islam, specifically with things like Ramadan. Right?
Yeah.
It's like, dude, you really don't get it. Stay out of it. Okay, you're a smart guy. You're good at astrophysics.
Stick to astrophysics. Yeah. You know what? We have. I've actually seen a couple of, let's say, respectable Islamic thinkers who are very sort of conscious of that being the trend, and who will just outright, like, when asked a question that is not exactly in their area of specialization, they'll go like, nope, go talk to these people.
Sure.
Right? Just
sure.
They're not, and that by the way seems like a reasonable thing to do, right? If somebody's coming to you looking for truth, and you know that you're not an expert at a thing, then it doesn't make any sense to open your mouth on the thing. So you either go with I don't know, and that's where it ends, or if you happen to know who is a specialist, then you go like, go see Bob, because Bob is a specialist at that.
Right. There's a certain need to put aside one's own ego in doing that, though, which is something that's lacking in our society. So we just have far too many people who feel like saying I don't know means somehow taking away their own position, their own influence. I think that's where some of that comes from. And bringing it back to what Nasr is saying here in this first sentence, I do think that means that Muslims need to do this as a communal kind of endeavor, right? In the sense that it's not like we're going to find that one great Muslim thinker who is going to be able to give us all the answers on this subject. Just looking recently at COVID, and specifically the subject of vaccines regarding COVID, what we see happening among the actual people of knowledge, right, is that scholars are going to doctors and working with them on these types of issues. Like, okay, what should Muslims think about this? Because at least right now, one of the big issues is there's a COVID vaccine coming out, and well, should we take it or not? Is it actually acceptable or not? And so yeah, I think the best way to handle that is, I guess we can call it a multidisciplinary approach.
Well, yeah, and just to clarify for anybody listening, that the question isn't like, are vaccines acceptable? Because yes, vaccines are acceptable. There's a particular bit of nuance to the way that some of these vaccines are derived, and that's really where
that's
the rubber
part of it
hits the road.
Yeah, that's part of it, and I have seen fatwas on that subject. But just more generally, I've been concerned because I've been seeing some people, some Muslim figures, who what they're basically doing is that there is a strain of thought among Muslims that I guess we would call anti-establishment, which I guess, especially anti-American government, which really shouldn't be that big of a surprise considering all the things that the American government has been doing over the last couple decades. If you feel that way, and then the government says, we developed this vaccine, trust us, you've got people who are, because they have this anti-government, anti-establishment tendency, it's leading them in that direction of, well, should we even really trust this thing? And it's unfortunate because it ends up with you kind of heading towards the realm of the anti-vaxxers. And that's obviously really concerning because that's, anti-scientific, anti-Islamic, and so on and so forth. But it's something that we're having to deal with right now.
And there's a bit of context which you don't have in a bunch of other places. So, lacking that, the ability to answer that question, should we trust the government on this? That has to be a local question, because the government always depends on the locale. So, whoops.
Sure.
How are you hoping to translate Saudi position on trusting the government regarding whatever into an American position of trusting the government on that same thing? The systems of government and the way that it operates and it doesn't operate, and what it can and can't do, what it does and doesn't get away with, the history, the everything is so radically different that you can't just import a foreign idea and hope that it matches the context in which you're operating. And one of the examples I can use for my students, just to sort of understand why the context is important, you ever have a math class where the way that the tests are handed out to students is like you have two tests, and so like row 1 gets test A and row B, 2 gets test B, right? So you can't cheat. Now, to me, trying to take somebody else's answer is kind of like cheating off of somebody who has a different test. Yes, it's an addition question, but they have a 2 plus 2 equals 4, and you have a 2 plus 3. And yes, you're looking at their answer for question 1, but if you don't have the same question 1, then you can't just copy their answer and hope that it works. Alright, so we continue. Alright, so studying it in depth and making the result of this knowledge known to the rest of the Islamic world were the okay, so that really should be a dash after that. So studying it in depth and making the result of this knowledge known to the rest of the Islamic world. The thing to be studied in depth here, I think, as bears noting, isn't just Islam. It's getting that understanding of religion in the West. So the responsibility isn't just to look at how Islam does and doesn't work in the West, like what's available as opposed to anywhere else that you are, but also to understand the varieties of religious experiences in the West, or really it's in wherever you happen to be, because that context is trying to give you a whole bunch of different moving parts that you really ought to know. So religion in the West concerns things like the development of that religion, of those religions, their history, the problems that they encountered, the ways that they dealt with those problems, whether those solutions did or didn't work, the ways of operating. For example, one of the simple things is Bosnian Muslims in the West have this idea of, oh, let's make a mosque. It'll be just like in Bosnia. And, no, it won't. Because the mosque in Bosnia is primarily to go pray at and have, your big events at. And that's sort of it. And that's fine because you have a dominant culture system that introduces you to Islam everywhere. Right? On TV, you'll see an imam talking about whatever. You'll see interfaith dialogue. You'll see all sorts of things. So the role of a mosque is very particular because of the context where it's located. you can't have that in the West because that context is absent. So you're not getting the rest of that education just by living there the way that you would get it just by living in Bosnia. So suddenly what it means to build a mosque is this entire additional thing that now has to compensate for the loss of those services by the society in general, that you have to now figure out how to sort of implement through this organization that you're putting together.
Right, sure. And imagine what happens if you leave those things out. Right? So you don't have all those additional services. Well, you are probably also not going to be living within walking distance of the masjid too. So if you don't have regular reasons to go there as well, it seems that this actually gets back to, I guess we could say, the fundamental problem that Nasr wants to address in the entire book. Because the entire purpose of the book is supposed to be a young Muslim's guide to the modern world. That implies that there is a problem that young Muslims are facing in the West right now, as that being the reason why he's even writing this book. So what do we get if we just have a place to pray and maybe have the occasional event like an iftar? Well, you end up with the next generation not really being connected to the religion. I mean, unless they're getting it all from their extended family. Assuming that their extended family all even came here, right?
And certainly what happens to converts who don't have an extended family, who all of that.
Right. So the good news is that a lot of Muslim communities here, though, have realized that kind of thing. And instead of just having a masjid, we instead have something that functions a lot more like an Islamic center. Right? Now, there's still a lot of work to do. But we're seeing more and more organizations that are making more of an effort to be involved in more things than just, this is a place for Jummah.
Yeah, fair enough. At least there's some effort. But I have to say, I think that a lot of the places, at least where I've been, haven't really picked up on the fact that there's this difference. And so, for example, so many imams are actually brought in from overseas. Can you speak up? I don't know. Okay. Hold on. Where's the text message from? Right. So you have the issue of imported imams, and that means that your khutbahs are going to be, never mind possibly in a different language or like with a very thick accent, and that thick accent may not be a problem if, let's say you're part of the Desi community, and so everybody speaks with a particular English accent. So even if the imam is speaking not in Urdu but in English, everybody's used to that accent, right? But bring in somebody from the side who isn't part of that ethnic group, and their ability to comprehend what's being said or understand why these particular issues are issues is suddenly compromised, right? Same thing with particular types of educational efforts. So, for example, did you go to do sort of Sunday school here?
Yeah, I went to a few different Sunday schools over the years.
All right. Now, that idea of those Sunday schools kind of works out because what's happening is, traditionally, the child is supposed to get a bunch of other Islamic stuff at home throughout the week, and then they spend like one day, they're over there, they do that, and then they come back, and there's something that sort of
memorize Quran, learn Tajweed. I mean, literally, there were 3 classes in a typical Sunday school that I went to. It was Islamic studies, Quran, and Tajweed.
That's exactly what I taught at Hawaii. Yeah. So, but the idea is that like you'll be able to pick up a bunch of this at home, and with your parents and your grandparents, and you're going to have nephews and nieces, and if they're around the same age, they're all learning the same stuff. If they're a bit older, they can help you out, and all the rest of that. And so, like, you only needed to officially go for a couple of hours a week to sort of give you the new thing. Then the rest of your society is sort of going to help you learn over the course of the next 6 days before you go again. But that's not the case here. Now, I'm not saying you need to have Sunday school twice a week or something, but the way that we conceptualize what that Sunday school is supposed to do, and the role, for example, of parents who are now your primary point of contact with Islam, right? Because society's sort of been stripped out, that has to be understood within this context so that you can properly understand what to do, and where the situation differs enough from what maybe the parents went through, so that you understand where you gotta pick up the slack, right? You can't just copy paste from India or from Bosnia or from Morocco. Like, it doesn't work. Those are very, very different situations. I mean, in fact, I don't know about you, but me growing up here, every year I had to explain to all the people in my classes in school what Ramadan was, right? In Bosnia, everybody, Muslim or not, knows what Ramadan is, the same way that everybody knows what Easter is, right? And in fact, in Bosnia, you know that there's 2 different Easters, because there was also 2 different Christmases, East Orthodox and Catholic. But like, everybody knows that because it is public knowledge, because that's just what the society.
Right. No, yeah, I mean, I had to deal with some of that myself. I think that I'm just trying to remember right now. I mean, I think that basically I just had to kind of explain it once for each group of friends. Is what it basically amounted to. And the single most important part was, why are you not joining us for lunch? Right? Because when I was a kid, I used to just go to the library. When I got older, I actually kind of could take it. I guess I was kind of tougher, or my stomach was tougher at least. And I mean, I could basically sit there with my friends and still talk with them while they were eating lunch, and that was fine. And then it was just, why are you not eating with us? But yeah, I mean, I can remember a few times where, yeah, definitely, being a Muslim in a place where no one else in that particular school was Muslim or knew much of anything about Islam, resulted in some rather awkward situations. So the reality is, the typical Westerner, typical American, knows very little about Islam. And unfortunately, a lot of what they know is also wrong. But we're really not concerned with that in this chapter. We're concerned with the inverse of that. The fact that the typical Muslim doesn't know much about the West and much about religion here. Unfortunately, including most Muslims who are actually living here. But it is especially a serious problem with Muslims who aren't. If we go back to page 136, Nasr actually talks about this idea over here. He has a paragraph where he says, 2 diametrically opposed points of view concerning religion in the West are to be seen among Muslims. Some consider all Westerners to be Christians, with the small Jewish minority being, of course, the exceptions, and often refer to Westerners as those Christians, as if the West were the West of the Middle Ages, when the Crusades were carried out and Western civilization lived in what has been called the Age of Faith. Another group of Muslims hold the opposite view, that all Westerners are materialists or agnostics and skeptics, and in fact there is no religion among the Westerners. I've heard both of those in one way or another from Muslims, both overseas and Muslims who live here. One good example was, you want to go back to like the Bush era, around 2001 to 2004 or so, especially with the invasion of Iraq, right? A lot of Muslims, especially outside of America, viewed that as essentially like another crusade, right? And it's like, well, I mean, I don't know if crusaders is really an accurate term here. There's some rather serious historical problems. The goal of the crusaders was to actually conquer the land and take it for themselves and make a Christian nation there. These guys seem a lot more just interested in getting the oil. Right? They're more capitalist crusaders than religious crusaders in this case. Anyway, and then of course there's the idea that, oh yeah, there's really no religion over there in the West. They're all just, atheists or agnostics, which is basically atheist light. and they're all really just materialistic. And
I've heard both of those sentiments from like the exact same people. Just depending on what you're talking about. So like invasion of Iraq, yes, that is a crusader thing, and then music, oh, those godless heathens. So it's a really interesting sort of problem there.
Godless crusaders.
Yes.
Essentially. All right. So anyway, that is really the big issue here that Nasr wants to address is Muslims don't really know much. We have a responsibility to know. At the same time, we shouldn't really be counting on any one person or maybe even a few people to kind of figure this all out for us. It's more of like a communal obligation, right? It's fard kifaya.
Yes.
Right? We have a communal obligation to make sure that we understand the place that we live in.
But I would say on a grand scale we have a fard kifaya, but since you have to live here, that I would argue makes it fard ayn for us to understand the place where we live. Now, you don't need to go get a PhD in this, but you do need to understand the place where you live so that you don't have the either of those very, very wrong outlooks.
Nothing in this should be construed as a fatwa.
Yes, please, thank you. We're using terminology that you might be aware of as a general kind of guideline.
This is a more general understanding of obligation.
Neither one of us here is qualified to begin to give a fatwa, so there's that. So he actually continues this in a really fun way. He says, so to make the result of this knowledge known to the rest of the Islamic world, where the contact with the West has bewildered many Muslims, not only the young but also old. And so this, have you seen the movie Rosewater?
I have not. No.
So it's Jon Stewart of The Daily Show wrote and directed it. And it's, so you have this Iranian American with, I think he's sort of a well, let's call it culturally Muslim sort of individual, and the guy lives in America, and so he goes back to visit home, and there is I think it's set in the midst of that Green Revolution thing that they had, and so he gets arrested as a possible spy and imprisoned, right? And so there's a little bit of sort of violent treatment of him, but like really it's the isolation and all that's getting to him. But he's, they're asking him these questions, like to tell them what's going on in America, what's America really like, and what's America planning, and so he tells them what he knows, which is nothing, right? Because the guy's a nobody. And as he's sort of explaining what life in America is like, they don't believe him, and so the beatings continue. And so finally, at one point, he just decides to feed into the stereotypes that the Iranians in Iran have about America, right? And so he just starts inventing these varieties of conspiracy theories, and how everybody over here is taught in school that they need to hate Iran, and like it's just like this most ridiculous set of lines that you've ever seen if you've been to America. And suddenly they believe him because that is their perception of what America must be like. So telling them that like nobody really cares about most things, especially the kinds of things that you might care about if you are from a place like Iran or Pakistan or whatever. It's such a foreign concept to them that they're just like way off base. So in order to understand both what it's like for people elsewhere, and to be able to situate yourself in that place. If you happen to move there, you have to know what that place is actually like. So that's what I meant by sort of the Fad Ein thing, right? Like, if you're going to live here, you need to understand that here, wherever that is, whether, if you want to go live in China, you need to go understand China. Otherwise, you can't meaningfully integrate into that society. And that integration, by the way, doesn't mean losing Islam, but just being a functional member of that society, being a functional Muslim in that society.
How about we move on to the next sentence?
Right, yeah, I think it covers all of this.
Definitely. There is, however, no aspect of Western civilization that is more important for Muslims to understand than religion, both in its living reality and also in its long battle against secularism and anti-religious forces, which have waged a war against it since the Middle Ages. I think we've covered the first part of that as well, the idea that it's really important to understand religion as an aspect of Western civilization. But the second part of it, so he distinguishes between the living reality of religion in the West and also the long battle, so the history, against secularism and anti-religious forces which have waged a war against it since the Middle Ages. So within the first of those two stereotypes, the idea that, oh, they're all still Christians, that kind of implies that there hasn't been this huge battle that's been going on. It also may strike the reader, though, at this point as kind of surprising. He says there's a war, essentially, that has been going on against religion in Western civilization since the Middle Ages. That forces such as secularism have been at odds with mostly Christian ideas, or we can just call it Judeo-Christian as a catch-all phrase, and that it's been going on for hundreds of years.
So I think it's important to note, because it's so easy to keep only viewing the West and their, let's say, religious animosities in terms of how they've interacted with other religions. But what Nasr is talking about here is the way that inside of the West itself has been this battle between the Judeo-Christian, let's call it classical position, and the emerging, since the Renaissance roughly, secular position, which has been trying to overthrow that religious position. So the West has obviously throughout the colonial period had its own share of anti-Christian positions that it has taken abroad, but not in the way that would actually suggest that they're somehow unified as we the Christians at home. I think we miss that, and therefore we have trouble sort of distinguishing what's what. By the way, it should be noted that in the West, it's not like the locals here have a much better grasp on this either, right? So I'm sure you've heard the line, America's a Christian nation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and one side is pushing that as if Jesus founded the United States of America, and the other side is pushing against it as if Christianity has nothing to do with it. The thing I like to point out in my courses is that neither of the sides is correct, because it's a middle ground. When you have somebody like Jefferson writing about inalienable rights, what he's writing about is natural law, which is what Locke was writing about, which is what St. Thomas Aquinas, note the word saint at the head of that, was developing some 500 years earlier. So yes, you have that, but at the same time you take a look at the behavior of these people, particularly somebody like Benjamin Franklin, who was our ambassador to France, and what the French said about him in regards to let's call them houses of ill repute in Paris, and you find out that no, these people don't have anything to do with Christianity the way you normally think about it. But at the same time, they can't help but be products of their environment, which is so heavily influenced by Christianity, that of course it plays part in that. So of course this is a Christian nation, as in it arose, or its foundations arose out of a period where a whole lot of very Christian ideas were very much in the air. But of course it's also not a Christian nation in the same way that, you know, the Papal States are a Christian nation. So yeah, but most locals here don't have a sense of that, and it doesn't mean that it's unimportant. It just means that they don't understand their own history, and so they're a lot poorer for that than they need to be.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Your average American, and probably your average Westerner, counting Europeans, Canadians, etc. as well, actually doesn't have that strong of a grasp on religion, especially, you know, what you would expect them to know about their own religious history. Yes, there are plenty of exceptions, especially here in America. There are still large portions of the country that you would say are quite religious, but even there, take you know, say an evangelical, ask them to explain Catholicism to you.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, they only understand their own narrow tradition, right? Which is only a segment within Protestantism, which itself is quite fractured. I believe that is also a subject that he covers in quite a bit of detail in this chapter.
He does.
The different branches of Christianity. And then, for goodness sake, ask them about Orthodox Christians. What are they going to even know about that?
Or the Syriac Church, or the Nestorian Church, or the Copts, or the... Yeah, like, no clue whatsoever. One of my favorite things to read from my students is, you know, Christians and Catholics believe blah, and I'm like, ooh, think you missed the memo on that one. But yeah, so it's it doesn't mean that it plays any less a role, because if nothing else, there is so much religious thought that permeates this culture, because it can't help but permeate it, right? Common example, the story of Moses gets redone every couple of years, and it's always a bestseller, and people are always surprised, and they talk about it nonstop, and nobody's aware that they're, you know, watching and reading the story of Moses, because, you know, we rebrand it a little bit. But, you know, it's Star Wars, it's Superman, it's all of Harry Potter, it's Kung Fu Panda 2, it's like, it is a continual retelling of the exact same story, and so it's there. Louis C.K. had a whole bit on how Christianity sort of won in the West, and he goes like, "Let me prove it to you. What year is it?" Somebody from the audience yells out like, 2018. It's like, so 2018 years since what? Right? So I mean, that means that the way that we tell time is based on that. It is still the case that the majority of Western names are biblical,
especially for men.
So, like, it's very much here. Sort of like it or not, you are aware of a whole bunch of bits and pieces of religious things, because these are the things that made this country what it is, right? That they made the West what it is. The same way that you could, I don't know, you could strip out religion from the Chinese people, but like there's so much of their like cultural behavior which is based on things like Taoism and Confucianism that like it's going to remain as a cultural practice. You can't not have it, right? You can't wipe out history in that particular way. So yeah, it's not just a problem that Muslims somehow don't learn this history. It's a problem that nobody seems to really learn this history other than a couple of specialists.
Right. It's not like religion is a mandatory class in school.
Yes. Yes.
And I mean, regarding religious studies classes and religious studies departments in universities, that's not necessarily a good place to go to actually learn about religion.
Yeah, no, my wife has a master's in comparative religious studies, focused on Islam in China, and the majority of that department, for example, was atheists, which I always thought was just hilarious. But on the other hand, the majority of philosophy departments are people who don't actually believe Plato or Aristotle or anybody else for that matter. So maybe that's not all that different.
All right, so we've spent time here discussing one of the reasons why this matters so much, which is you need to know your history. He gives another reason in the next sentence. How about we take a look at that?
All right.
He says, Muslims can learn a great deal from this long battle, because today Islam also has to wage the battle against secularization and secularist ideologies, which have come from the West. Now, I look at that and I see two separate things really going on here. There are Muslims here who have to deal with the secularization of this society and the forces that have caused that. And they're kind of, at least since most Muslims here are immigrants, they're kind of walking into the middle, right? It's not like they had the effects, on their culture for a long time, and now they've reached this point. It's like they come in and just kind of like, bam. It's like they've been hit by it, right? It's like you were saying earlier about the issue with masjids, right? This society is so different. I honestly think that probably this society for Muslims would be better if it were a religious society. It could be a Christian religious society, and as long as they are not trying to burn us at the stake, it's probably actually a better place to be in, because at least it is a society that places a high value on religion.
Right, and therefore, if nothing else, it's something that is far more familiar to us, coming from other places, than this just sort of.
Right, as long as there's a certain sense of tolerance that exists in there, then they can be like, okay, so you guys are different, you follow a different religion, we're going to try to convert you when we let you in, right? But I mean, at least you know what the score is in that case, right? You know that they want that, right? As long as it's not, we're going to kill you. But on the other hand, if you're coming into a place where the influences, instead of being religious influences, just a different religion, are instead secularizing influences, you run into the very serious danger of your next generation just losing their religion. And it's not like there's a ready-made set of tools and strategies that already exist in this society for how to combat it, because your modern day Christians here have done a very lousy job of trying to combat the secularization. They're losing the battle. They've been losing it badly for a long time now. So it's not like we can come in and we can be like, okay, so the Christians have developed these methods and we can see these methods working to counter secularism. We're now going to take their methods, we're going to adapt them in an Islamic context, and there we go. We've got our own shield. Like, I don't think that anything like that really exists. I mean, that's not to say that every person who calls themselves Christian in this country is really not Christian or is secularized, but I mean, it really does seem like the ones who, at least how they're portrayed, right, the ones who are trying their hardest to hold on to their religion are typically portrayed as crazies in the society.
Yeah.
And are largely pariahs. Like, if they're really trying to do it, right? There's that certain amount, like, okay, well, if you're moderately religious and, just don't try to push it on me.
Yeah, you can be religious at home, just don't bring it out into the public.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. But, this brings us to a point that I like to talk about when we cover diversity in my classes. And one of the sort of issues is that people tend to think of like, oh, look, it's useful to study other people, places, things of that nature, if they have done something better than the way I've done it, right? So if I can take their conclusions and use them. But I think what we actually are missing, and I think that this is part of the reason why Nasr is saying that studying the history and development of religion in the West is important, is because you can see all the things that didn't work. In other words, you've just taken all of those options off the table.
Right, don't make the same mistakes twice.
So, the standard is like, why, you don't need to try crack to figure out that you don't want to be a crackhead. You just see a crackhead and you're like, okay, I don't know what he did, but not that. And then you get to move forward. So if you look out and you go like, okay, you had this large swath of churches that were built in the 60s and 70s that are now financially collapsing, and they're getting bought out, whether it's by masjids or by strip malls, or whatever it is. I don't know how they set it up, but they must have done it badly, because here's the result a generation later. Right? So that's a thing to learn. And as we talked about a couple of weeks ago on the art and architecture section, the idea of stop relying on charitable donations is an idea that we really should be taking from the fact that all these churches which rely on charitable donations are collapsing. So if they can't do it, what makes you think that you're magically better?
Yeah, it's not even just the churches, it's also the schools, right? So, especially among Catholics in this country, they developed a whole school system, right? The whole Catholic school system,
yes,
as an alternative, right? That definitely sounds like a lot better idea than just counting on Sunday schools to solve the problem. So, lately, due to declining membership, enrollment, and donations by extension, they're starting to have to consolidate or to shut a lot of these down.
Ooh.
Yeah, so we're kind of in the earlier stage in that right now, which is, So not only do we have this problem with churches, but also with schools, right? So Catholic schools are their own school system. They developed this whole system after large numbers of Catholic immigrants came here, not happy with the public school system. I mean, it's a better way to solve the problem than just counting on, Sunday school to resolve it. And so, as time has passed, enrollment is declining, and by extension, donations are declining. And what we get from that is situations where some of these are having to close, or they're having to consolidate at this point. One of my coworkers, one of the teachers where I work, she works full-time at one of these Catholic schools, and they were just going through a round of closings where, let's say for the sake of argument, there's like 5 or 6 of them that are in this particular diocese. That's the term that they use. And, due to funds, 1 or 2 of them has to close. They're going to go from 5 to 4, or from 6 to 5. Now, for Muslims, we're in the stage right now where we are increasing the number of Islamic schools. When I first moved to the Chicago area, there was at least one that I knew of in the western suburbs. That was Islamic Foundation School. I believe CPSA also existed at that time. Actually, yes, it did. So there was 2. Now, goodness, I don't even know how many there are within a 20-minute drive of me right now, but probably at least 4 or 5. I mean, doesn't ICW have their own school? Essentially, I think it's mostly just elementary, younger kids. I know Dar es Salaam has its own school. Masjid Uthman basically started their own school within their masjid too. That's on top of Islamic Foundation and CPSA, and I'm sure I'm forgetting others, and that's just for the western suburbs of Chicago. That's not even the southwest suburbs where all the Arabs live, or the northwest and the northern suburbs where the Bosnians live, or in the city itself, right? So we've got quite a few here, and it's growing, which is a great thing. But you've got to think that there was a time when, for the Catholics, it was growing. And now it's not. Right? At some point it must have peaked, it plateaued, and then it started falling off. So if you wanted to anticipate the problems in advance, you would have to say to yourself, okay, how did they get to that point where they reached the peak, right? What events happened there that stopped the continued growth? And then what events led to the eventual decline? Because if you can anticipate it, I think that people generally, human beings generally stay pretty much the same. I know that, there are plenty of societal changes. We talked before about how much this society is progressing really quickly in a lot of ways. But ultimately, the problems that people face and human behavior tends to stay pretty constant, or at least tends to follow cycles, right? So you can expect that, at least if you look at it in very broad strokes, in terms of what happened, you can start to identify the problems. Then, within those broad strokes, you look at more specifics, and those specifics may change based upon the particular time in that culture. So the broad strokes could just be, about 20 years before enrollment in churches, or I guess you'd say attendance at churches declined, there was a decrease in birth rates. There was a decrease in donation levels. There was, a serious fracture that happened between two different groups, right? And you can look at those kinds of things and you can say, and I'm not saying any of those things are what actually happened, right? I'm just making things up for the purpose of this. It's hypothetical. But you can look at something like that and then you can say, okay, we can now try to identify what could possibly go wrong for us. And if you can start identifying in advance, then you can start figuring out, okay, how do we stop that?
You buy yourself time to test things out before everything goes down. By the way, I think one of the biggest indicators is actually something like the average rate, so the average age of the attendees, because that's a question of, are you at least replacing the initial population?
Yeah, so going back to the hypothetical that I was giving there, if you looked and you said, well, 20 years before, we had to start shutting things down, the average age surpassed 40 of our attendees, or the number of children attending started falling off dramatically. And then there's kind of that delayed effect where 20, 30, 40 years go by, and you shouldn't be all that surprised at that point when you then find that those kids who didn't attend are now middle-aged adults who don't attend.
And I think on top of that, you can look at that like, all right, so how did they raise funds? And you're like, oh, it was charitable donations. Okay, how often did you have major disasters? One of the things with, like, for example, fundraising in Florida that I always thought was iffy. I'm like, you really should not be a charitable institution down there, is annual hurricanes. And you have no idea how bad the damage is going to be year to year. So this year you get, donations are fine. Next year donations are fine. There's also no major hurricane events. And then the hurricane hits the part of the place where you normally get donations from. It's like Panama City got wiped out, like just leveled in parts. And guess what? That year there's no donations. because nobody has free money. Everybody's rebuilding their homes. So all of a sudden your ability to fund yourself goes out the window due to something that you can't control. So if you're in the kind of place where you're seeing the a rise of these things, or the average cost of repairs is going up, the idea of relying primarily on donations is now becoming a lot less tenable than it would have been, 10, 20 years ago. Or just the very concept of relying on donations rather than setting it up as a business model, like all of these things are just sort of the kind of things that you should be able to anticipate by looking at other things, or at history, at looking at the way that other people tried things. Opening up a bookstore 20 years ago was a fine proposition. Opening up a bookstore today is an idiotic proposition, because Amazon, like, you just can't compete. So, if you're not learning from history, I don't know what you hope to accomplish, other than just repeating the mistakes of, the last set of people.
Sure. As I said probably about 10, 15 minutes ago, for this sentence there's actually two things that I thought of here. So he says that Muslims can learn a great deal from this long battle, because today Islam has to wage the battle against secularization and secularist ideologies which has come from the West. That applies not just to Muslims here, that's the first one, but the second one is there's a battle going on for ideas throughout the Muslim world.
Yes.
Which he covers quite a bit of back in chapter 7 as well, but again over here in chapter 8. And we have the problem, and again, I think this is something that Muslims in the West can help with, but we can't solve the problem entirely, because going back to what we said earlier, you need to be familiar with the context. So I don't know the context of Egypt, right? Its social or religious context, for example, or of Indonesia, right? So if Western ideas are in danger of invading Indonesia, let's say, then I can help with the part that's about identifying what those ideas are and what happened here, but at the same time, the people there need to also, provide the other piece of the puzzle, which is, right, their own social and religious context. So in that context, I think that Muslims in the West can help, but that has to be more of a joint effort.
Yeah, it's kind of like, to take it to COVID, if you have your own strain of it, somebody who did research on a different strain can help, right? They have some information, but you need to account for the fact that your strain is slightly different, and then you need to account for those differences. But the work they did is helpful, right? It's not nothing, so they can shave some time off of the work that you have to do to make it work.
It's interesting you mentioned COVID, because I think there's an even stronger example. It's directly related to geography here as well, which is just because a solution worked in one area for how this country managed to contain COVID doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work in another area, but it could be helpful, right? You may have heard some news stories lately, in just the last month or so, lauding certain countries like New Zealand. New Zealand has managed to completely contain COVID. They had 12 cases in the last week or something, and that's because they did XYZ, with XYZ, of course, always being whatever that particular person wants us to do here. That's why you should always ask yourself who the speaker is.
Yes.
What is their goal? What are they trying to get out of it? So anyway, I'm thinking about New Zealand, like, they're an island
with a very low human population, like
under
sheep
5 million.
Outnumber people in New Zealand by like a hell of a lot.
They are separated from everyone else. They can lock down the country a lot more easily. And again, fewer people, more spread out. They can limit travel in and out of the country very easily. So their solution isn't necessarily going to be our solution. I mean, there are ways in which it could help, but the population of New York City and its metro area is greater than the entire population of New Zealand, and it's densely populated as well. What works in New Zealand is not going to work in New York City.
There's the common issue I have with people talking about how banning guns has worked in Japan. It's like, do you realize how different Japan is just in terms of their entire worldview, in terms of their entire outlook on everything, right? Even their gangsters aren't big on guns. Like, every single part of Japan is radically different. So of course they have a thing that works there, but it's not going to work here. Not
even in
the
that case,
same way.
It's assuming that there's a cause and effect that doesn't necessarily exist there, right? You are taking two different pieces of information, right? One is number of guns, or whether they've been banned, and the other one is amount of crime. And you're assuming that there's causality there. Now, maybe there's causality in one country, but there isn't in another. Right?
I think they were looking at shootings primarily,
yeah.
And you can't really do shootings without guns.
Yeah.
That's kind of a thing. But yeah, like you can't copy paste the same way that you can't copy paste. Like South Korea has a quote, the best educational system on the planet, and that is by particular metrics regarding of what they produce, right, and the quality of what they produce through their educational system. But again, you have a country where education is seen as like the most important thing in the world by everybody, including all the kids. And so it's like, yeah, no joke, you're going to get that.
Your future is determined by your test scores.
Yeah, so it's a really big deal in South Korea. But you can't just, demand that American high schoolers spend, 16 hours a day studying, because we have a completely different mindset.
Yeah.
And so you're not going to produce anything like the same results. Now, if you want to turn around and go like, okay, how did they end up with this mindset that education is the most important thing, and can we try to import some of that, then that would long term change your attitudes towards education. And then that would change the way that we do education. But you can't take the conclusion and somehow hope that if you just apply that, the antecedent is going to magically manifest out of nothingness. Alright, so next part, he says, Islam can learn from how Christianity and also Judaism have encountered such forces, and can also come to know the soul of the Western people better by understanding the role that Christianity has
had historically.
Oh, wow, yeah, sorry. Has had historically, and even continues to have to some extent to this day, upon the worldview, the ethical outlook, and also the social and private lives of men and women in the West. So, again, we've covered actually most of this so far. The anti-religious modernism, which now threatens Islam and Muslims everywhere, can be fully understood only by understanding the religion of the civilization in whose bosom modernism first developed, against which it rebelled, and whose tenets it has been challenging through constant battle since the birth of the modern world in the Renaissance. So, again, this is one of those things that you can only actually get through that historical understanding of what's going on, because otherwise I feel like what you're doing is the best you can do is you can fight the symptoms, and that's not particularly helpful, right? That sort of takes us back to the whole sort of shut up and believe way of thinking. If let's say skepticism produces a certain genre of questions, your options are ignore the questions or address the questions. Now, ignoring the questions, especially as we look historically, doesn't work. Right? You can ban people from asking those questions, but it doesn't mean the questions have gone away. It just means that, next generation is going to not be like the previous generation. They're going to lose a good chunk of their faith. The generation after that is just going to leave it entirely. So the ability to answer the question really requires you to understand, where does this question originate from, rather than what is the exact formulation that I use to answer this question. I remember this is back when we were both in undergrad. We had a mutual friend who went to some conference or something, and they had one of these Muslim youth courses he was telling me about, and what they did is they taught them the answers to questions asked by atheists, and one of them was, if God is all powerful, can he make a rock that's so heavy that he can't lift it? And there's like a very specific answer that they learned, like they memorized. And I thought to myself, like, I can ask you 8 million variations of that exact same question. If you don't understand the problem, you're sort of right out of luck, because all I have to do is change my wording a little bit and you no longer have an answer. But if you understand that what that question actually is just noise, because it loses logical coherence about halfway through, then you understand that that's not actually a question. Hence, it does not require an answer, because you might as well have just made animal noises at me the entire time. But that's a matter of understanding logic and breaking down what is said, and it doesn't matter what the particular question is. You're understanding the core of what's going on. So that failure to understand the core and sticking only to the superficial manifestations of a problem is a rather big deal, and not only in the West, but like everywhere throughout the Islamic world. It's like one of those things where you go like, we're going to ban women from wearing jeans. Like, I don't think you understand the issue. It's not the jeans that are the problems, right? Like, if they chose to wear slacks, would you have the same attitude or no? Like, how many different brands of pants are you going to have to ban women from wearing until you sort of understand what the issue is? So it's this like weird let's play catch up with symptoms problem that we end up dealing with.
Right. Well, it's reactionary.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't know if we actually covered that in our video last week, but it is something that Nasr does cover in chapter 7 quite a bit.
We did.
Which is that he criticizes really all three of the groups as being reactionary in different ways. One of the first problems with reactionary thinking is that it kind of has to be emotional. That has to be the core that it comes from, because it has to be a response to something, and you're basically putting yourself in that position of, what's a better way of putting this? You're basically accepting certain ideas, right? A certain framework from the starting point, and that's the big issue that a lot of Muslims have. So the example you just gave a minute ago about the rock question there, right? If you're trying to memorize some kind of answer, you're probably assuming certain things from the beginning there about the issue, that you'd be better off just being like, hey, wait a second, no, you're getting these aspects of what Allah is wrong from the beginning. But yeah, you can't understand that unless you understand the principles underlying it. Now,
I think, by the way, it's a very interesting point here, because he dates it back to the Renaissance, and I think this is where a lot of people get their idea of the conflict thesis from, the science and religion being inversely proportional. And just to sort of tie it into context, and the failure to understand the context on everybody's part, misunderstanding what happened in Europe which is where the Renaissance happened, is why Westerners have this habit of trying to extrapolate the experiences of Europe on a global level, right? Which is why you have the idea of like religion is anti-science, as if the word religion somehow magically encompasses everybody equally. I mean, keep in mind when you say religion, you're trying to account for the Druids in like Celtic England, and the Greeks and the Romans and the Chinese with their concept of the Tao, and the Muslims, and like some 80-year-old tottering to church on a Sunday, and ISIS interpretation of things, and like all of that in one term. That's a little rough to actually meaningfully cover everything. So not understanding what religion is and how it differs from one place to another means that you get to make idiot statements like religion is anti-science, as if religion was all a monolithic whole. By the same token, you have this sort of reverse reading of the West as being monolithic. Either they're all crusaders or they're all atheists, and sort of misunderstanding what exactly is going on and how to meaningfully understand it.
And I think Nasr does a good job in this chapter of, especially with Christianity, of breaking down different Christian groups. He doesn't really get into specifics about what they believe and how those beliefs differ. I think that would probably require a whole book in and of itself instead of just a chapter. I think that's definitely something that the average Muslim should know, at least to some extent, though.
Yeah, that's again, if you live in a place, you need to understand the place the same way that you learn what are the roads and what are the supermarkets and all the rest of that, so that you can go and buy the things that you need to live. You need to understand the context of the environment that you're sitting in, because otherwise you literally don't know how to act in regards to it. And then you're just going to get pushed to action in a reactionary way when something happens that you think that you don't like. That's just going to create more problems long term, I think, for everybody, for your society and for you and for your attempt to practice your religion in wherever you are.
I think that he does briefly talk about Judaism in the West here. I think that can offer a really good model for what we need to watch out for as well. Jews in this country, and just more generally around the world, are basically divided up into three major groups. You've got Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform.
I think he talked about that a bit.
Yes, he does talk about that a bit in the chapter. And the Orthodox group are essentially, well, what you'd expect, right? When you think to yourself, like as Muslims, we think like, I mean, we have obligations, we fulfill the obligations. God said, do these things, we do them, right? And I mean, maybe some of the things they do seem a little unusual to us, well, because again, they're a different group, right? They're following a very strict set of rules that are in the Old Testament, and then their commentary on those ideas, which they built up over literally millennia. They're very legalistic. But then on the exact opposite extreme, you got the Reform Jews, who are more ethnically than religiously Jewish. Like, they consider themselves that. That is not a position that other people take regarding them. They do not consider themselves religious anymore. At most, they might go to the synagogue like once a year. And it's not for Hanukkah, it's for Yom Kippur, right? Because Hanukkah is so close to Christmas, and ironically, we are also recording this on Christmas Day. That's just kind of the influence of America, right? That we kind of had to have something that the Jews do around the same time, so they started treating Hanukkah like it was this huge deal. and your typical Jew will be like, I mean, yeah, Hanukkah's nice, it's important and everything, but Yom Kippur, that's the really holy day. That's the day where we fast for, I don't even know what it is, like 40 hours straight or something. I think it can depend upon the group. But among many Jews, they will spend the entire day in the synagogue praying on Yom Kippur. That's like supposed to be, I think that represents one of like the really important events in their journey with Moses. It's not Passover.
See, like, I should have Maida for this. She'd know that offhand.
Right. I mean, obviously Passover matters a lot too.
But
that one, many
Yom
people
Kippur is like when you're written into the book of life or into the book of death. So it's kind of like really, really big deal.
Anyway, the point is, even the not too observant Jews may still observe that particular day. So the big concern that I see there is the idea that we've got a substantial and unfortunately growing number of Muslims who seem to be kind of segmenting themselves into these different groups as well. What was the most recent one? I forget who came out, but I think it's Netflix. They're now starting their own series just in time for Ramadan, 3 or 4 months from now, and it's something really liberal. Like, I don't even remember what this series is about, but it has a Muslim, quote, Muslim protagonist who doesn't really seem to do any of the things that a Muslim is supposed to do. And of course, the response I'm seeing people online is like, Muslims were not asking for this. Just in time for we don't care, right? Why are you coming out with this now?
They're gonna see if they can catch a new market.
I feel like I gotta look it up now.
Capitalism is a fun combination with religion. Right, we're now at like 80 minutes, so we're gonna have to cut a lot of that.
Some stuff out.
You find that, I'll drop it in the description below.
It may not have been Netflix. It could have been Amazon. Someone else.
At any rate,
really.
Thank you guys for joining us. If you get questions or comments, feel free to email us or leave it in the comments. And we'll see you next week.